Welcome back to the Casual Ethnographer. My name is Elizabeth. I am your internet culture lady, and this is another long-form video, another Casual Ethnographer talk. Molly here is joining me for the beginning of this. This topic today will cover Gaza and the West Bank today. This is part 7 and the final part in our 7-part series about the context and history of how the situation in Gaza got to be what it is today. So if you're unfamiliar with my channel, the way these work is I pick a topic, I do some research, and I take you through the process. Initially, this was supposed to be like a 2 or 3-parter, but the more I got into it, the longer it got. So tried to keep it contained as best I could. So 7 parts. This is the final part. If you've been through all the parts, thank you for joining me. This hopefully will button everything up for you. So let's get started. This is part 7 in our series. So if you're joining me for the first time, I want to give you a very quick sense of where we've already been. And if you've watched parts 1 through 6, this will help anchor where we are picking up today. In part 1, we explored the origins of Zionism in the late 1800s, how the movement emerged and why it resonated with Jewish communities facing rising anti-Semitism in Europe, and how early Zionist institutions and migration began reshaping life in Palestine long before the creation of the State of Israel. In part 2, we moved into the era of Mandate Palestine. We looked at how British policies, Jewish immigration, and Palestinian resistance shaped the political landscape. And we followed the story through the 1948 war, the refugee crisis, and Gaza's years under Egyptian administration, ending with the 1956 Suez Crisis. In part 3, we walked through the years leading up to 1967. We looked at what daily life was like for Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank under Egyptian and Jordanian rule, the rise of Palestinian political identity, and the regional tensions that culminated in the Six-Day War and the beginning of Israeli military occupation. In part 4, we stepped into the years immediately after 1967. We looked at how the region responded to Israel's sudden territorial gains, including the Khartoum Resolution, and the early diplomatic landscape that shaped the next 2 decades of occupation. In part 5, we moved through the period from the early 1980s through the year 2000. We looked at the Lebanon War, the rise of local political networks inside Gaza, the first Intifada, the return of the Palestinian leadership under the Oslo Accords, and the slow collapse of the peace process, all through the lived reality of Palestinians navigating water scarcity, shrinking land access, restricted fishing zones, unstable schooling, strained medical care, and increasing economic dependency. In part 6, we stepped into the early 2000s. We looked at the collapse of the Camp David talks, the political spark that followed, the eruption of the Second Intifada, the deepening crisis of the Palestinian Authority, the evolution of Hamas, and Israel's unilateral disengagement from Gaza in 2005, ending with the 2006 elections, the 2007 split between Hamas and Fatah, and the beginning of the blockade that still shapes life in Gaza today. Today, in part 7, we're stepping into the modern era, the years from 2007 to the present. This is the period that includes the tightening blockade, the wars of 2008, 2012, and 2014, the electricity and water crises, the Great March of Return, the 2021 escalation, the political stagnation in the West Bank, the regional shifts of the early 2020s, and the catastrophic war that began in 2023. And as always, I'm trying to understand these events through the lived realities of Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank, not just the headlines or the diplomatic milestones, but also the voices of ordinary people documenting their lives on social media, often in real time, as the world watches. So let's move on now to the period of 2007 to 2014, the blockade, isolation, and the early wars. After the 2006 elections and the 2007 split between Hamas and Fatah, Gaza and the West Bank entered 2 separate political realities. Gaza came under Hamas governance. The West Bank remained under the Palestinian Authority, and Israel, with support from Egypt, imposed a blockade that reshaped every aspect of life. So the blockade takes hold, 2007-2008. The blockade restricted nearly everything that could enter or leave Gaza. Movement of people severely limited, imports tightly controlled, exports nearly eliminated, fuel shortages begin almost immediately. Electricity becomes unreliable, factories shut down, farmland near borders becomes inaccessible, fishing zones reduced, and Gaza's economy collapses rapidly. For ordinary Palestinians, this meant sudden and dramatic changes in daily life. Impact on daily life. Families who once had stability found themselves in crisis. Loss of steady income, students unable to leave for study abroad, medical patients denied travel permits, water, electricity, and sewage systems begin to fail. Food insecurity increases and unemployment rises sharply. This is the moment when Gaza's humanitarian crisis becomes chronic. The 2008-2009 war. By late 2008, tensions escalated into a full-scale conflict. 3-week war, widespread destruction of homes, schools, hospitals, hundreds of thousands displaced, infrastructure heavily damaged. Blockade plus bombardment become a single-lived reality. The tunnel economy, 2007 to 2013. In response to the blockade, a vast network of tunnels emerged along the Gaza-Egypt border. Brought in food, fuel, building materials, household goods, became lifelines for basic necessities, also became military targets, many destroyed in repeated operations. For years, tunnels were the only way to access goods that could not enter through official crossings. The 2012 escalation, a shorter conflict than 2008-2009, but it reinforced a pattern: escalation, ceasefire, humanitarian strain, repeat. The cycle defined much of the next decade. The 2014 war, the most devastating conflict of this period. 50-day war, entire neighborhoods flattened, tens of thousands of homes destroyed or damaged, schools, hospitals, UN shelters hit, over 200,000 displaced at peak, reconstruction slow due to blockade, long-term psychological impact, especially on children. Daily life under blockade, 2007 to 2014. By the end of this period, Gaza's humanitarian crisis was deeply entrenched. Electricity available only a few hours per day, clean water scarce, sewage systems repeatedly fail, unemployment extremely high, food insecurity widespread, movement almost entirely restricted. Early digital documentation, around 2014. This is the first moment when Gazans begin using social media to document their lives. Short videos and photos circulate globally. Electricity and internet limitations keep this early wave small. Marks the beginning of ordinary people becoming primary sources of information. So let's talk for a moment about understanding the pattern, why these conflicts happen. Before breaking down each event, it helps to understand the structural pattern. So Gaza is under blockade. Israel conducts military operations inside Gaza. Palestinian armed groups fire rockets into Israel. Ceasefires are negotiated, then break down, and the cycle repeats. But the specific triggers matter, especially in our context here. So 2008-2009 war, Operation Cast Lead. What triggered it? The immediate trigger was Israel breaking a ceasefire on November 4th, 2008, when the IDF entered Gaza to destroy a tunnel and killed several Hamas militants. Hamas had not fired rockets during the ceasefire until after this raid. Rocket fire resumed in response to the Israeli operation. So who fought who? It was the Israeli Defense Force, the IDF, versus Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and several smaller Palestinian armed groups. Where was it fought? Inside the Gaza Strip, so airstrikes plus invasion in southern Israel, rocket fire. Israel launched a major military operation in Gaza after breaking a ceasefire, and Palestinian armed groups responded with rocket fire. Moving on now to the 2012 escalation. What triggered it? The 2012 escalation followed a similar pattern. Israel carried out targeted killings of Palestinian militants. Palestinian groups responded with rocket fire. Israel launched airstrikes in response. This was not a ground invasion like 2008-2009, but it was still a significant conflict. So who fought who? It was the IDF versus Hamas and Islamic Jihad. Where was it fought? Inside Gaza. Airstrikes. Southern Israel. Rocket fire. In this conflict, Israel initiated the major strikes, and Palestinian groups responded. Moving on to the 2014 war, Operation Protective Edge. What triggered it? The triggers were layered. So rising tensions in the West Bank after the kidnapping and killing of 3 Israeli teens. Israel arrested hundreds of Hamas members in the West Bank. Hamas and other groups increased rocket fire from Gaza. Israel launched a large-scale air campaign followed by a ground invasion. So who fought who? IDF versus Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and other armed groups. Where was it fought? Inside Gaza, so airstrikes and ground invasion, and southern and central Israel, rocket fire. In this conflict, Israel launched the large-scale military operation, and Palestinian groups responded. So were there conflicts also happening in the West Bank? And the short answer is no. They were all happening in Gaza. The West Bank experienced arrests, raids, clashes, but not the large-scale wars seen in Gaza. Israel treats Gaza and the West Bank as separate security theaters. The blockade, the political split, and the presence of Hamas in Gaza created a different dynamic. So my question was, if there's a blockade, how are weapons making it in? So first, smuggling through tunnels, 2007, 2013. Before Egypt destroyed most tunnels in 2013, the Gaza-Egypt border was riddled with underground passages. Weapons were smuggled through tunnels from Egypt's Sinai Peninsula. These included rifles, RPGs, explosives, and components for rockets. Some weapons originated in Iran, China, Russia, and North Korea, according to analysis of captured or photographed arms. Tunnels also brought in raw materials used to build weapons locally. This was the primary method of weapons acquisition during the early blockade years. 2. Maritime smuggling. Small scale, but still real. Despite the naval blockade, some weapons were smuggled by sea. Small boats attempted to reach Gaza's coast. Weapons were hidden in shipments of food or goods. Some were intercepted, others got through. Experts note that boat smuggling was limited, but not non-existent. 3. Local manufacturing inside Gaza. This was the most important piece for me to understand. Even under blockade, Hamas and other groups manufactured weapons inside Gaza. Qassam, I hope I'm saying that right, Qassam rockets. Early versions were crude, short range. Mortars, improvised explosive devices, anti-tank weapons made from scavenged materials, and explosives made from fertilizers and industrial chemicals. The blockade restricted imports, but did not eliminate access to raw materials. Groups became extremely resourceful, repurposing metal pipes, scrap metal, unexploded ordnance, fertilizers, and smuggled chemicals. This is why the arsenal grew even when the borders were sealed. 4. Black market purchases in the region. Weapons circulate heavily in conflict zones across the Middle East. According to analysis of Hamas's arsenal, some weapons were purchased on the regional black market. These markets operate in Iraq, Libya, Syria, and other war-torn areas. Components and full weapons can be bought and then smuggled through Sinai or by sea. This explains the presence of Iranian sniper rifles, Chinese and Russian AK-47s, North Korean RPGs, and Bulgarian-made launchers. These are not manufactured in Gaza. They are acquired through networks that operate far beyond the Strip. 5. Why the blockade didn't stop weapons. The blockade was designed to prevent weapons from entering Gaza, but tunnels bypassed land borders, small boats bypassed naval patrols, local manufacturing bypassed import restrictions, black market networks bypassed diplomatic controls. Meanwhile, the blockade did severely restrict food, medicine, fuel, building materials, and civilian goods. This is why many Palestinians argue that the blockade harmed civilians far more than it prevented militarization. 6. Were these weapons used in the West Bank? Short answer is no. The West Bank is a different security environment. Gaza's wars 2008, 2009, 2012, 2014 were fought inside Gaza. The West Bank saw raids, arrests, clashes, but not large-scale rocket warfare. Hamas's rocket infrastructure is Gaza-based, not West Bank-based. So even under blockade, armed groups in Gaza acquired weapons through tunnels from Egypt, small-scale maritime smuggling, black market purchases, and local manufacturing. The blockade restricted civilian goods far more effectively than it prevented weapons from entering or being produced. Moving on now to 2014, 2021, stagnation, humanitarian decline, and intermittent conflict. By the end of 2014, Gaza was physically devastated, economically depressed, and politically isolated. The blockade remained in place. Reconstruction materials were heavily restricted, and the political split between Gaza and the West Bank had hardened into a long-term reality. The years that followed were not defined by a single dramatic event, but by a slow, grinding deterioration of daily life. So the post-war reality, 2014-2016, reconstruction moved painfully slowly. Building materials restricted or delayed, tens of thousands remained displaced for years, entire neighborhoods still in rubble long after the war. Schools and hospitals operating out of temporary structures, electricity crisis deepens, often 4 to 6 hours per day. Water quality deteriorates as aquifers are overdrawn and contaminated. For many families, this period felt like an extended aftermath rather than a recovery. Economic collapse and unemployment. The blockade and repeated wars created a near-total economic standstill. Unemployment among youth reached some of the highest rates in the world. Fishing zones remain restricted, limiting one of Gaza's key industries. Farmland near borders remain inaccessible. Factories destroyed in 2014 remain unrepaired, and exports remain almost non-existent. Daily life becomes a cycle of scarcity, improvisation, and waiting. Electricity and water crises. Infrastructure failures become defining features of life. Electricity often available only a few hours per day. Households rely on generators, which require expensive fuel. Water desalination plants operate at limited capacity. Most tap water becomes undrinkable. Sewage treatment plants fail, leading to contamination of groundwater and the sea. These conditions shape every aspect of life: cooking, bathing, studying, storing food, charging phones, and running medical equipment. The Great March of Return, 2018 to 2019. This is one of the most important events of the period and one of the first moments when social media documentation becomes globally visible. Weekly protests along the Gaza-Israel fence. Demonstrators call for the right of return and an end to the blockade. Israeli forces respond with live fire, tear gas, and rubber bullets. Thousands injured, including journalists and medics. Dozens killed. Many injuries result in permanent disability. This is also when Gazan creators begin posting more frequently, showing medical tents, mass casualties, amputations, smoke from burning tires, families marching together, and the sensory reality of protest days. These images circulate widely online, shaping global understanding of Gaza in a new way. 2019 to 2021, political stagnation and internal strain. The political landscape remains frozen. No Palestinian elections since 2006. Hamas governs Gaza. The PA governs the West Bank. Reconciliation attempts repeatedly fail. International diplomacy stalls. Settlement expansion continues in the West Bank, and movement restrictions remain severe. Inside Gaza, frustration grows, not only with Israel and the blockade, but with internal political paralysis. Moving on now to the 2021 escalation. Another major conflict erupts in May 2021, triggered by tensions in Jerusalem. I hope I'm going to say this right. Sheikh Jarrah evictions, Al-Aqsa clashes. Hamas fires rockets toward Israeli cities. Israel launches extensive airstrikes on Gaza. Residential towers collapse. Roads, media offices, and infrastructure hit. Dozens of children killed. Thousands displaced. Again. This conflict is shorter than 2014, but deeply traumatic, especially for children who had already lived through multiple wars. Next, social media becomes a central lens, so late 2000s, 2021. This is the period when digital documentation becomes a regular part of Gaza's story. More Gazans have smartphones. Instagram and TikTok become accessible. Short videos show daily life under blockade. Creators document electricity shortages, water collection, cooking, studying, and displacement. And global audiences begin to follow Gazan voices directly. This sets the stage for the explosion of real-time documentation during the 2023 war. So since I mentioned expensive fuel, let's just sit with that for a moment. Fuel, weather, and daily survival under the blockade. Fuel shortages in Gaza affect far more than generators. They shape heating, cooking, transportation, refrigeration, water access, and basic survival, especially for displaced families living in tents. Gaza's climate, what the weather is actually like. Gaza has a hot, semi-arid climate with cool, wet winters and hot, dry summers. Winter, so December through March, daytime highs are typically 63 to 68 degrees Fahrenheit, 17 to 20 degrees Celsius. Nighttime lows, 50 to 54 degrees Fahrenheit, 10 to 12 degrees Celsius. Rainfall, significant, especially in January, up to 116 millimeters. Conditions, cold, damp, windy, muddy. Summer, June through September. Daytime highs, 82 to 86 degrees Fahrenheit, 20 to 30 degrees Celsius, peaking near 89 degrees Fahrenheit, 31.7 degrees Celsius in August. Nights, warm and humid. Rainfall, near zero for months. UV index, extremely high, so 10 to 12. Transitional seasons, spring and fall. Spring highs, 65 to 75 degrees Fahrenheit, 18 to 24 degrees Celsius with moderate rainfall. Fall highs, 74 to 80 degrees Fahrenheit, 23 to 27 degrees Celsius with decreasing rainfall. This means Gaza is not a desert with warm nights. Winters are cold and wet, summers are hot and humid, and tents offer almost no protection. Why fuel matters so much. Fuel is needed for heating, so winter cold is dangerous in tents. Cooking, gas shortages force people to burn wood, trash, or plastic. Transportation, ambulances, aid trucks, water delivery, generators, electricity for hospitals, charging phones, refrigeration, water pumps to access clean water or run desalination units. When fuel is scarce or unaffordable, every one of these systems collapses. Let's talk about winter in tents. Cold, wet, and miserable. Because winter temperatures drop into the 40s and 50s Fahrenheit, so 8 to 12 degrees Celsius at night. And because Gaza receives heavy winter rainfall, tents become soaked, muddy, cold, drafty, and mold prone. Without fuel, no heaters, no dry clothing, no way to boil water, no way to cook except over open fires, and no way to dry blankets or bedding. Families often burn scrap wood, trash, or plastic for heat, creating toxic smoke. Summer intense heat, humidity, and dehydration. Summer brings 86 degrees Fahrenheit, 30 degrees Celsius days with high humidity, extreme UV exposure, no shade, no refrigeration, no fans or cooling, without fuel. This leads to dehydration, heat exhaustion, food spoilage, inability to store medicine, and increased disease spread. Children and the elderly are especially vulnerable. Cooking without fuel. Cooking gas is often unavailable or unaffordable. Families resort to burning wood, burning trash, burning plastic, using makeshift stoves made from scrap metal. This produces toxic fumes, respiratory illness, fire hazards, and limited ability to boil water for safety. Food insecurity worsens because people cannot cook what little they have. Transportation and fuel. Fuel shortages cripple transportation. Ambulances cannot run, aid trucks cannot distribute food, water trucks cannot deliver potable water, families cannot evacuate, fishermen cannot operate boats, and farmers cannot reach fields. This deepens the humanitarian crisis far beyond inconvenience. Electricity and fuel are intertwined because Gaza's grid is unreliable. Generators are essential for hospitals, incubators, dialysis machines, refrigeration for medicine, charging phones, critical for communication and documentation, water pumps, and sewage treatment. When fuel runs out, these systems fail. Gaza's winters are cold and wet, with temperatures in the 40s and 50s Fahrenheit at night and heavy rainfall. Summers are hot and humid with temperatures in the 80s and extreme UV. Without fuel, families in tents cannot heat their shelters, cook food, boil water, run generators, or transport aid. Fuel shortages turn ordinary weather into life-threatening crisis. So what happens when you cannot afford a tent? That was a question I had. Many displaced Palestinians do not have tents. Even the tents that do exist are worn out, torn, or destroyed by weather or strikes. Those without tents rely on whatever minimal shelter they can find. So sleeping outdoors or on sidewalks. Some families sleep directly on the ground, on sidewalks, or beside other people's tents. A UN news report describes an elderly couple who fled Gaza City and stayed for 2 nights without a tent, sitting on the sidewalk next to the tents and hiding beside one of them. They had no walls, no roof, no bedding, only the ability to crouch beside someone else's shelter for minimal protection. This is common for people who flee suddenly, lose everything, or cannot afford even basic materials. Makeshift shelters from scraps. Families often build improvised shelters made from plastic sheets, old blankets, cardboard, broken furniture, nylon tarps, scavenged wood, or metal. These makeshift structures offer almost no protection from rain, wind, cold, heat, or sandstorms. Al Jazeera reporting shows tents built from old blankets and fabric scraps offering minimal protection from rain and doing little to regulate temperatures. For those who cannot afford even these materials, the situation is worse. Crowding into other families' tents. Some displaced people crowd into the tents of relatives, neighbors, or strangers. A typical tent is about 20 square meters and houses 10 people, giving each person 2 square meters of space, far below UN standards. Adding more people makes conditions even more cramped, unsanitary, and unsafe. This is often the only option for people with no tent of their own. Sleeping in ruins or partially collapsed buildings. Some families shelter in bombed-out buildings, partially collapsed apartments, damaged schools, or abandoned structures. These are extremely dangerous. Buildings weakened by strikes can collapse without warning, especially during storms or aftershocks from nearby bombardment. Exposure to weather without shelter. People without tents face the full force of Gaza's weather. Sandstorms that fill lungs with dust and tear apart shelters. Reports describe tents about to collapse and children coughing constantly as sand pours in. Cold winter rain that floods camps and destroys belongings. Heavy rains flooded thousands of tents and makeshift shelters, leaving families exposed. Heat and sun exposure. In summer, tents offer almost no shade. Without a tent, people are fully exposed. For those without any shelter, even basic survival becomes a daily struggle. Fires and secondary displacement. Even when people do have tents, they can lose them instantly. Israeli strikes have ignited fires that burn tents sheltering displaced families, leaving dozens homeless again. Families who lose tents in fires often have no replacement, forcing them back onto sidewalks or into open fields. No money, no materials, no options. The core issue is not just affording a tent, it is tents are scarce. Materials are restricted, aid is blocked or delayed, prices are inflated, families have no income, and displacement happens repeatedly. This means many people simply cannot obtain shelter at all, regardless of money. Moving on now to the West Bank developments in parallel, 2014-2021. While Gaza was experiencing blockade, war, and humanitarian collapse, the West Bank was living through a different but deeply connected trajectory. The two territories are politically split, but their histories remain intertwined. Understanding the West Bank during this period helps to see the full picture of Palestinian life in the modern era. Political stagnation and fragmentation. After the 2007 split, the political landscape hardened. The Palestinian Authority, the PA, continued governing the West Bank. Hamas governed Gaza. Reconciliation attempts repeatedly failed. No national elections were held after 2006, and public trust in political leadership declined. For ordinary Palestinians, this meant living under a government they did not elect, with no clear path toward unity or representation. Expansion of Israeli settlements. Settlement growth accelerated during this period. New housing units approved in existing settlements. Outposts expanded and retroactively legalized. Settlement roads and infrastructure widened. Palestinian land was fragmented into smaller, disconnected areas. This created a patchwork geography that made movement, agriculture, and economic development increasingly difficult. Daily life under occupation. The West Bank did not experience the large-scale wars that Gaza did, but daily life was shaped by checkpoints, roadblocks, night raids, arrests, home demolitions, land seizures, and settler violence. These pressures created a constant sense of instability and unpredictability. Economic strain and dependency. The West Bank economy remained heavily dependent on Israeli permits for work, international aid, limited local industry, and remittances. This dependency made families vulnerable to sudden policy changes, closures, or permit revocations. Jerusalem flashpoints. Jerusalem remained a central point of tension. Evictions in neighborhoods like Sheikh Jarrah, restrictions at Al-Aqsa Mosque, clashes during Ramadan, and protests met with force. These flashpoints often triggered wider unrest across West Bank and sometimes escalations involving Gaza. 2015 to 2016 wave of stabbings and clashes. A period of heightened violence emerged, often called the Knife Intifada. Individual attacks by young Palestinians. Increased Israeli military presence. Raids and arrests intensified. Checkpoints tightened. This was not an organized uprising, but a reflection of deep frustration and hopelessness among youth. Jerusalem crisis and its ripple effects. The events that triggered the 2021 Gaza escalation began in the West Bank and Jerusalem. Sheikh Jarrah evictions, police raids at Al-Aqsa during Ramadan, protests across the West Bank, clashes with Israeli forces, and hundreds injured. These events set the stage for the May 2021 conflict in Gaza, showing how interconnected these two territories remain despite political division. So daily life in the West Bank: water, agriculture, education, and healthcare. While Gaza faced blockade and repeated wars, Palestinians in the West Bank lived under a different set of structural pressures. These pressures shaped the most basic elements of daily life: water access, farming, schooling, and medical care, and they deepened over the 2014-2021 period. So let's start with water access. Water scarcity in the West Bank is not due to natural shortage alone. It is primarily the result of structural control over water resources. Israel controls nearly all major water resources in the West Bank, including the mountain aquifer. The Israeli National Water Company, and I am going to put this on the screen because you know I'm going to mispronounce it, Mekorot, decides how much water Palestinian communities receive. Many Palestinian towns receive insufficient or intermittent water, sometimes only a few days per month. Over 620,000 Palestinians in underserved communities are either unconnected to piped water or receive too little water to meet basic needs. Families often rely on water trucks, which cost 2 to 3 times more than piped water. When trucked water runs out, families, including children, walk long distances carrying buckets. Water scarcity affects hygiene, cooking, farming, and health. It also creates a heavy financial burden on already strained households. Moving on now to agriculture and land access. Agriculture has historically been central to Palestinian life, but farmers in the West Bank face severe constraints. Access to farmland is restricted by checkpoint settlements and military zones. Water shortages make irrigation difficult or impossible. Herding communities struggle to maintain livestock without reliable water. Settler violence and land seizures disrupt planting and harvesting cycles. Many farmers cannot reach their olive groves except on limited days approved by the military. Agriculture becomes less viable each year, pushing families into economic precarity. Education. Education in the West Bank is more stable than in Gaza, but still shaped by occupation. Students and teachers must pass through checkpoints, causing delays and absences. Schools in Area C, under full Israeli control, face demolition orders or lack building permits. Some children walk long distances because roads are blocked or unsafe. Clashes, raids, and settler attacks near schools disrupt learning. Despite these challenges, literacy rates remain high, reflecting the cultural value placed on education. Healthcare. Healthcare access varies widely across the West Bank. Urban centers like Ramallah and Nablus have functioning hospitals, but they face shortages of equipment and specialists. Rural and marginalized communities often lack clinics or rely on mobile medical teams. Movement restrictions delay emergency care. Ambulances may be stopped at checkpoints. Water scarcity directly affects hygiene, sanitation, and disease prevention. The system functions, but is fragile, under-resourced, and unevenly accessible. Moving on now to 2021 to 2023, rising tensions and regional shifts. By the time the 2021 escalation ended, both Gaza and the West Bank were living in a state of exhaustion. The political split remained unresolved, the humanitarian situation in Gaza was worsening, and the West Bank was experiencing increasing pressure from settlement expansion, raids, and economic strain. The years between 2021 and 2023 were marked by a slow tightening of conditions that set the stage for the catastrophic events that followed. Aftermath of the 2021 escalation, the ceasefire ended the immediate violence, but the underlying conditions did not improve. Gaza's infrastructure remained heavily damaged. Reconstruction materials were restricted or delayed. Thousands of families remained displaced. Electricity and water crises continued. Psychological trauma among children deepened. In the West Bank, the 2021 events intensified political frustration and distrust in leadership. Increasing military raids in the West Bank. Beginning in 2022, the West Bank saw a sharp rise in Israeli military operations. Near-daily raids in cities like Jenin and Nablus, arrests of young Palestinians, armed clashes between Israeli forces and local militants, civilian casualties during raids, road closures and curfews in certain areas. These operations created a climate of fear and instability, especially for families living near flashpoints. Growth of armed groups in the West Bank. New, loosely organized armed groups emerged, particularly in northern cities. Young men formed local brigades in response to raids. These groups were not centrally controlled by Hamas or the PA. They operated independently, often with limited resources. Their rise reflected deep frustration with political stagnation. This development marked a shift in the West Bank's security landscape. Settlement expansion and settler violence. During this period, settlement activity accelerated. New housing units approved in existing settlements, outposts expanded, settler attacks on Palestinian villages increased, olive groves burned or uprooted, and roads blocked or taken over. For Palestinian farmers and rural communities, this period was especially difficult. Economic decline and rising prices. Both territories experienced worsening economic conditions, high unemployment, rising food prices, fuel shortages, increased dependency on aid, and limited job opportunities for youth. Families struggled to meet basic needs, and many households relied on remittances or humanitarian assistance. Regional shifts and diplomatic realignments. The broader Middle East was also changing. The Abraham Accords normalized relations between Israel and several Arab states. Palestinian leadership felt increasingly isolated. International attention shifted away from conflict, and aid levels fluctuated as global crises competed for resources. These shifts contributed to a sense of abandonment among Palestinians. Gaza's humanitarian situation worsens. Even without a major war, Gaza's conditions deteriorated. Electricity remained limited to a few hours a day. Water quality continued to decline. Hospitals faced shortages of medicine and equipment. Unemployment remained among the highest in the world. Young people saw no path forward, no jobs, no travel, no political change. This was the environment leading into 2023, a population exhausted, isolated, and living under conditions that were already unsustainable. So let's talk about what Israeli raids looked like in the West Bank. When we talk about raids, we're not talking about soldiers staying on the streets. Raids almost always involved entering homes, businesses, refugee camps, and apartment buildings, often at night. What actually happened during a raid? Israeli military raids typically include entering homes, often between 2 and 5 a.m., breaking down doors or blowing them open, searching bedrooms, closets, storage spaces, detaining or arresting one or more family members, confiscating phones, laptops, or documents, questioning residents, sometimes occupying the home temporarily as a lookout point, sometimes using rooftops for snipers, sometimes damaging property during searches. These raids occur in refugee camps, city centers, villages, apartment buildings, shops, and commercial spaces. Raids are routine, not exceptional. Many families experience them multiple times a year. Why the raids happen. Reasons vary. Arresting a specific person, searching for weapons, intelligence gathering, collective punishment after an attack, showing presence in the area. But for civilians, the experience is the same. Soldiers inside their home, often in the middle of the night. So let's talk about electricity for a moment. Who actually gets the electricity? Electricity comes from Gaza's single power plant, often shut down due to fuel shortages. Israeli power lines, limited supply. Small solar panels, if families can afford them. And generators require fuel and often unavailable. When the grid turns on, only certain neighborhoods receive power. The schedule rotates. Outages are unpredictable, voltage is unstable, and power may last 30 minutes to 2 hours. People in tents, rebel, or displaced camps often do not have access to the grid at all. So, walking to electricity. People do that. Common places include hospitals, UN shelters, mosques, schools, aid distribution centers, and the homes of relatives in neighborhoods with better access. People bring phones, power banks, small appliances, and medical devices like nebulizers, CPAP machines, etc. Charging a phone can take hours of waiting in line. So what about coffee shops? Here in the U.S., that's a common place for people to go and they get a drink, get a snack, and do some remote work. So let's talk about that for a moment. Before 2003, Gaza had coffee shops, internet cafes, restaurants, bakeries, small malls, barbershops, and clothing stores. These were not luxurious, but they were real functioning parts of urban life. Coffee shops were especially important because they had generators, they had Wi-Fi, they were social hubs, students studied there, and freelancers worked there. After 2023, most coffee shops and internet cafes have been destroyed, closed, without fuel, without electricity, without Wi-Fi, in areas too dangerous to reach. Some still operate sporadically, but only if they have a generator, fuel, a working router, and a safe enough location. And this is rare. Let's talk about accessing internet. Internet access is extremely limited and often dangerous to obtain. People rely on cell towers when they are functioning. eSIMs, that's a digital SIM card activated through foreign networks, Wi-Fi hotspots in hospitals or UN shelters, satellite connections, rare and often targeted, and walking long distances to find a signal. Creators like Bassan and Rosie often climb to higher ground, walk toward functioning towers, wait for hours for a signal, and upload during brief windows of connectivity. This is why their posts sometimes appear in bursts after long silence. So let's move on now to 2023-2025, the catastrophic war. By 2023, Gaza and the West Bank were already in crisis. Gaza's infrastructure was collapsing under the weight of blockade and repeated wars. The West Bank was experiencing near-daily raids, settlement expansion, and political stagnation. The broader region had shifted diplomatically, leaving Palestinians increasingly isolated. Into this environment came the events of October 2023, which triggered the deadliest and most destructive period in the history of the conflict. The October 2023 attack and immediate aftermath. On October 7, 2023, Hamas launched a large-scale attack on southern Israel. Israel communities near Gaza were overrun. Civilians and soldiers were killed. Hostages were taken into Gaza, and Israel declared a state of war. The attack shattered the status quo and set off a massive military response. Israel's military campaign in Gaza. Israel launched an unprecedented air, land, and sea campaign. Widespread airstrikes across the entire Gaza Strip. Ground invasion beginning in the north and expanding south. Destruction of residential neighborhoods. Strikes on schools, hospitals, UN shelters, and refugee camps. Communications blackouts. And fuel, water, and electricity cut off. The scale of destruction exceeded all previous wars combined. Mass displacement. The population of Gaza, over 2 million people, was displaced repeatedly. Entire neighborhoods evacuated. Families fled from north to south, then from south to central areas. Tents and makeshift shelters became the primary form of housing. Many slept in the open or in the ruins of buildings. Camps became overcrowded, unsanitary, and unsafe. Displacement was not a single event, but a continuous shifting reality. Collapse of infrastructure. Gaza's infrastructure, already fragile, collapsed almost immediately. Electricity grid shut down, water desalination plants stopped functioning, sewage systems overflowed, hospitals ran out of fuel and supplies, and roads were destroyed, blocking ambulances and aid trucks. Basic survival, water, food, shelter, and medical care became a daily struggle. Humanitarian crisis. The humanitarian situation deteriorated rapidly. Food shortages, lack of clean water, spread of disease in crowded camps, children suffering from dehydration and malnutrition, pregnant women giving birth without medical care, surge in amputations due to blast injuries, and psychological trauma on a massive scale. Aid deliveries were limited, inconsistent, and often unable to reach those most in need. West Bank escalation. While the war was centered in Gaza, the West Bank experienced its own crisis. Increased military raids, mass arrests, checkpoints tightened, settler violence escalated, entire communities displaced, and economic activity slowed dramatically. The West Bank did not experience the same level of destruction, but the atmosphere was one of fear, instability, and repression. Regional and international dynamics. The war reshaped regional politics. Diplomatic tensions rose across the Middle East. Protests erupted globally. International organizations raised concerns about humanitarian law. Aid agencies struggled to operate, and negotiations over hostages and ceasefires stalled repeatedly. The conflict became a central global issue, drawing intense scrutiny and debate. Social media documentation becomes central. This is the period when Gazan creators become primary sources of journalism for the world. Bazan documenting displacement, water scarcity, and survival. Rosie showing daily life in tents, community kitchens, and children's routines. And Motaz capturing destruction, rescue efforts, and frontline realities. And there are many more creators out there. Their footage provided real-time updates, human context, sensory detail, emotional texture, and evidence of conditions on the ground. For many viewers, these creators became the only window into Gaza's lived reality. The war's long tail, 2024 to 2025. Even as active fighting shifted or paused, the consequences continued. Reconstruction remained impossible under blockade. Displaced families remained in tents or makeshift shelters. Water and electricity infrastructure remained non-functional. Schools and hospitals remained destroyed. Psychological trauma deepened. Economic collapse persisted. Families searched for missing relatives, and entire communities were permanently altered. By 2025, Gaza was facing a generational crisis with no clear path to recovery. So one of the questions I had to do with what was the stated reason for the October 7th attack, and this is what I found. Hamas's stated reasons for the October 7th attack. Hamas leaders publicly framed the attack as a response to long-standing grievances. Their statements emphasized the blockade of Gaza, Israeli military raids in the West Bank, settler violence, restrictions of Al-Aqsa Mosque, and the occupation as a whole. These were the political and symbolic justifications they offered to their own population and to the region, but the public statements were not the whole story. Evidence of strategic motives from recovered documents. Documents recovered by Israeli forces in Gaza's tunnel network, reported by the Wall Street Journal and summarized by First Post, indicate a more specific strategic objective. Hamas leadership believed the emerging normalization deal between Israel and Saudi Arabia was an existential threat to their movement. Documents show that Hamas leaders, including, I'm going to say this wrong, so I'll put it on the screen, Yahya Sinwar, viewed Israel-Saudi normalization as a crisis that would sideline the Palestinian cause and isolate Hamas. The attack was intended to derail the normalization process. This aligns with the timing. The attack occurred while U.S. brokered negotiations between Israel and Saudi Arabia were advancing. So the endgame appears to have been shattering the regional diplomatic trajectory, reasserting Hamas as a central actor, and forcing the Palestinian issue back onto the global agenda. This does not justify the attack, but it helps explain the strategic calculus. So was the attack well planned? Yes, independent analysis shows planning took at least 2 years, involved long-term deception to mislead Israeli intelligence, used drones, paragliders, breaching explosives, and coordinated ground teams, involved thousands of fighters with specific mission assignments, and reassembled special forces-style operations rather than ad hoc militant activity. This level of planning supports the idea that Hamas had a strategic objective beyond symbolic retaliation. So let's move on now to the present day, life in the aftermath. By the present day, Gaza and the West Bank are living in the long shadow of the 2023-2025 war. The physical destruction is staggering, but the deeper crisis is human: displacement, hunger, disease, trauma, and the collapse of every system that makes ordinary life possible. The political landscape remains frozen, and the humanitarian situation is still acute. So Gaza's physical landscape. Large parts of Gaza remain unrecognizable. Entire neighborhoods flattened, roads destroyed or blocked by rubble. Schools, hospitals, universities in ruins. Water and sewage networks non-functional. Electricity grids still offline. Tents and makeshift shelters stretching across open areas. The physical environment shapes every aspect of daily life: movement, safety, health, and survival. Displacement is a permanent condition. Displacement is no longer temporary. It is the default. Families living in tents for months or years. Some still sleeping in the open or in ruins, camps overcrowded and unsanitary, repeated relocations due to shifting military zones, and no clear timeline for reconstruction or return. For many children, home is now a tent, a tarp, or a borrowed corner of a shelter. Food, water, and sanitation. Basic survival remains precarious. Food shortages persist. Malnutrition widespread among children. Clean water extremely limited. People rely on contaminated sources. Diarrheal disease and dehydration common. Toilets and showers scarce in camps, and trash and sewage accumulating in living areas. These conditions create a constant risk of outbreaks. Healthcare systems in collapse. Gaza's healthcare system is barely functioning. Hospitals destroyed or severely damaged. Remaining facilities overcrowded. Shortages of medicine, equipment, and staff. Surge in amputations and untreated injuries. Pregnant women giving birth without medical care. Chronic illnesses unmanaged. And medical health crisis affecting all age groups. Doctors describe the situation as beyond emergency. Education interrupted. Education has been disrupted for an entire generation. Schools destroyed or used as shelters. No stable classrooms. Children studying in tents, if at all. Teachers displaced or unable to work, trauma affecting concentration and learning, teenagers losing critical years of schooling. The long-term consequences will shape Gaza for decades. The West Bank's parallel reality. The West Bank faces its own crisis, distinct but connected. Increased raids and arrests, settler violence displacing entire communities, economic stagnation, restrictions on movement, water scarcity and land loss, and political paralysis and public frustration. While not experiencing the same level of destruction as Gaza, the West Bank is living through deepening instability. Social media as documentation and survival. Creators continue to document daily life, but under extreme constraints. Limited electricity, unreliable internet, phones charged at hospitals, mosques, or aid centers, posts uploaded during brief windows of connectivity, videos showing food lines, water collection, tent life, and displacement. Global audiences rely on these creators as primary sources. This is the first major conflict in which ordinary citizens have documented their own survival in real time. Political stagnation and uncertain future. The political landscape remains frozen. No unified Palestinian leadership, no clear reconstruction plan. International diplomacy stalled. Regional tensions ongoing. Humanitarian aid insufficient. And families focused on immediate survival, not long-term planning. The future is uncertain and the present is defined by endurance. My kids just got home from school, so if you hear a little bit of noise, that's just them in their bedrooms upstairs. So let's touch now on who can leave Gaza or the West Bank today. Foreign nationals can sometimes leave Gaza, but only under extremely limited negotiated circumstances and not freely. So Gaza, the Rafah crossing into Egypt, is the only exit for civilians. Foreign nationals have been blocked from leaving at various points, including hundreds of Americans and other passport holders who were prevented from crossing because Hamas blocked the gate from the Gaza side, according to U.S. officials. When the crossing does open, it is only for people on an approved list, usually foreign passport holders, critically injured patients, and some aid workers. Even then, many foreign nationals arrive at the border and are turned away because their names are not on the list. West Bank. Foreign nationals can generally leave the West Bank through Jordan and Israel, but checkpoints, closures, raids, and permit restrictions can delay or prevent movement. The key difference is Gaza is sealed and the West Bank is restricted. Let's talk now about maternal, infant, and child mortality rates. So the pre-war baseline, Gaza and West Bank combined, maternal mortality ratio at that time was 16 deaths per 100,000 live births, 2023. This is relatively low for the region, so Max wanted to join us now. During the Gaza war of 2023 to 2025, the situation in Gaza deteriorated catastrophically. A 41% drop in births due to war conditions, 2,600 miscarriages, 220 pregnancy-related deaths, 1,460 premature births, 1,700 underweight newborns, and 2,500 infants needing intensive care. That's January through June 2025. UN Women estimates 6,000 mothers killed in the first 6 months. Hospitals destroyed or non-functional. Incubators without power. Women giving birth in tents. UNFPA described conditions as catastrophic and systematic denial of safe birth. Global comparison. Pre-war maternal mortality of 16 per 100,000, remember, was similar to upper middle income countries. During the war, maternal and neonatal mortality in Gaza rose to levels seen in humanitarian collapse zones, not stable states. This is one of the clearest indicators of systemic breakdown. Anthropological lens, so agency, mobility, and survival. Hunter-gatherers historically survived by mobility, moving to water, food, shelter, and safety. Their agency came from choosing where to go, adapting to seasonal changes, and relocating when resources were depleted. Gaza and the West Bank, the loss of mobility. Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank experience the opposite of mobility. In Gaza, sealed borders, no airport, no seaport, no freedom of movement, internal displacement without exit. In the West Bank, checkpoints, roadblocks, settlements, raids, and fragmented territory. So why this matters anthropologically? When a population cannot move to resources, the crisis becomes structural, not environmental, political, not ecological, inescapable, not adaptive. Agency is stripped away because you cannot leave danger, you cannot reach water, you cannot reach farmland, you cannot reach hospitals, you cannot migrate seasonally, you cannot flee famine or bombardment. In anthropology, this is the difference between resource scarcity and enforced immobility. And enforced immobility is far more lethal. So does this qualify as genocide? This is a legal question. It's not an opinion. So I'm going to try and frame this very carefully. Claims that it is genocide. Amnesty International released a report stating that Israel is committing genocide in Gaza. Physicians for Human Rights and UNFPA reports describe systematic destruction of healthcare, high maternal and infant mortality, conditions preventing births, mass civilian deaths, forced displacement. These findings align with elements of the Genocide Convention, such as preventing births within a group. Claims that it is not genocide. Israel and the United States have denied the charge. They argue the intent is to defeat Hamas, not destroy Palestinians as a group. So let's talk about population changes. In Gaza, Gaza population was projected to grow, but instead decreased by about 200,000 from the expected 2024 figure due to war-related deaths and displacement. Over 40,000 Palestinians killed, that's the Gaza Health Ministry, and about 110,000 people left Gaza through Egypt during the war. In the West Bank, population growth continues, but is affected by displacement from settler violence, economic strain, migration out of the region. Long-term demographic context. Gaza's population rose from 240,000 in 1950 to over 2.3 million in 2023. The war reversed decades of growth. The Gaza flotilla. Let's touch on that for just a moment. The flotilla is essential for context, for understanding the blockade. What it was, a series of civilian ships attempting to break the Gaza blockade beginning in 2010. The first flotilla carried humanitarian aid and construction materials. Israeli forces boarded the ships in international waters. 9 activists were killed. Why it mattered. It drew global attention to the blockade. It strained Israel-Turkey relations, and it led to Israel easing some blockade restrictions. Continued attempts. Flotillas continued in 2011, 2015, 2016, 2018, and 2025. All were intercepted or raided. The flotilla is a symbolic reminder that the blockade is not new. It has been contested for over a decade. So after writing those notes, I thought, let's go back and talk about what are the legal requirements for a genocide to occur. So, legal criteria for genocide of the Genocide Convention, 1948. Under Article 2 of the Genocide Convention, genocide means any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. There are 2 components. First, the mental element, so that's intent. And 2, physical acts. There are 5 categories. Both must be present. So the intent requirement, this is the hardest and most important part. The perpetrator must have the specific intent to destroy the protected group. As a group, in whole or in part, because of their identity, so national, ethnic, racial, or religious. This is what separates genocide from war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity. Those crimes can involve mass killing, displacement, or atrocities without the intent to destroy a group as such. Genocide requires group destruction intent, not just knowledge that civilians will die. The 5 genocidal acts. A state or actor must commit one or more of these acts with genocidal intent. So first, killing members of the group. This is self-explanatory. If done with intent to destroy the group, it qualifies. 2, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group. This includes torture, sexual violence, severe trauma, or conditions that cause lasting psychological harm. Third, deliberately inflicting conditions of life calculated to bring about the group's physical destruction in whole or in part. This is one of the most litigated categories. It includes starvation, forced displacement into unlivable conditions, denial of medical care, destruction of shelter, blocking humanitarian aid, and creating disease spread conditions. The key phrase is calculated to bring about destruction. Fourth, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. Examples include forced sterilization, denial of reproductive health care, conditions that make childbirth unsafe, separating partners, and policies that prevent family formation. And fifth, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. This includes adoption, re-education, or removal of children from their cultural identity. Additional punishable acts under Article 3. The Convention also criminalizes genocide itself, conspiracy to commit genocide, direct and public incitement to commit genocide, attempt to commit genocide, and complicity in genocide. These matter because a state or actor can be responsible even if the genocide is not completed. So then that brought to my mind, well, what evidence do you need to bring about these charges? So direct evidence versus inferred evidence. Courts recognize two categories of evidence for genocidal intent. So first, direct evidence, which is rare. Written orders, public statements, recorded speeches, internal communications. This is unusual because states and armed groups rarely document genocidal plans openly. Two, circumstantial evidence, common and accepted. International courts allow intent to be inferred from the scale of killings, systematic targeting, destruction of essential life systems, patterns of displacement targeting children, destruction of cultural or religious sites, denial of food, water, and medical care, and statements by officials that dehumanize the group. The ICJ and ICTY/ICTR have repeatedly ruled that intent can be inferred when it is the only reasonable inference from the pattern of conduct. This is exactly how genocidal intent was proven in Rwanda and Bosnia. The only reasonable inference standard. The ICJ uses a specific test. If the pattern of conduct can only reasonably be explained by an intent to destroy the group, then genocidal intent is established. This means you do not need a document saying, destroy them. You do not need a leader publicly announcing genocide, and you do not need explicit admissions. Courts look at what was done, not just what was said. Intent can coexist with other motives. A state actor can have multiple motives, so military, political, territorial, and still have genocidal intent at the same time. Genocidal intent does not need to be the exclusive motive. This is important because perpetrators often claim we were fighting insurgents, we were securing territory, we were restoring order. Courts have ruled that these explanations do not negate genocidal intent if the pattern of actions meets the criteria. Historical genocides without written orders. The US, Canada, and Australia committed genocidal acts against Indigenous peoples without explicit written plans. Courts and scholars classify these as genocide because children were forcibly transferred. Populations were starved. Cultural and religious practices were banned. Birth rates were suppressed. Communities were forcibly relocated. And disease and famine were knowingly allowed to spread. These acts fall under the Genocide Convention's categories, even without explicit documentation. This is why the legal standard allows inference. Why intent is often proved indirectly. The scholarship that I found explains that genocidal intent is a mental state. Mental states are rarely documented. Courts therefore rely on patterns, scale, and systematic nature of actions, and tribunals accept circumstantial evidence as valid and often decisive. This is not a loophole. It is a necessity. Otherwise, almost no genocide would ever be prosecuted. Let's move on now to the humanity aspect. So the past sections have walked through history, policy, blockade, war, displacement, mortality, and legal frameworks. But none of that matters unless we understand what it means to be a human being inside these conditions, to wake up in them, raise children in them, grieve in them, and try to hold on to a sense of self when every structure around you is collapsing. The loss of ordinary life. For most of the world, ordinary life includes waking up in a bed, turning on a light, making coffee, sending kids to school, going to work, planning for the future. For Palestinians in Gaza, and in a different way, the West Bank, these basic rhythms have been replaced by waking up in a tent or on the ground, searching for water, charging a phone at a hospital or mosque, cooking over burning trash, navigating checkpoints or rubble, and trying to keep children safe without the ability to move. The crisis is not just about destruction, it's about the erasure of the ordinary. Agency and the anthropology of being trapped. Human societies have always adapted to scarcity by moving. Hunter-gatherers followed water and game. Pastoralists moved herds seasonally. Farmers relocated when soil failed, and families migrated when economies collapsed. Mobility is one of the oldest human survival strategies. Gaza and the West Bank represent the opposite, enforced immobility. You cannot leave danger. You cannot reach resources. You cannot migrate seasonally. You cannot flee famine or bombardment. You cannot choose where to raise your children. Anthropologically, this is the stripping away of the most fundamental human tool, the ability to move toward life and away from death. The collapse of generational continuity. Every society depends on the ability to imagine a future. But in Gaza, schools are destroyed, universities are rubble, children are malnourished, mothers are dying in childbirth, infants are dying from preventable causes, and families are displaced again and again. This is not just a humanitarian crisis. It is a generational rupture. A society cannot rebuild if its children are traumatized, its mothers are dying, and its infrastructure is gone. The role of creators as witnesses. For the first time in modern conflicts, civilians, not journalists, not governments, are the primary narrators. Creators like Bassan, Rosie, Motaz, Plestia, hopefully I said those right, and dozens of others have become the world's window into Gaza. They document displacement, hunger, water collection, tent life, destroyed neighborhoods, the deaths of friends and family, and the small moments of joy that survive anyway. Their footage is not polished, it is not staged, it is not filtered through institutions. It is raw, immediate, and human. And because of the collapse of electricity and internet, every upload is an act of endurance. Walking miles to find a signal, waiting hours for a single bar of connectivity, charging phones at hospitals or mosques, filming while displaced, hungry, or grieving. These creators are not just documenting the war, they are documenting their own survival. The weight of witnessing. For viewers, this creates a new kind of moral proximity. You are not watching a distant conflict through a news anchor. You are watching a young woman in a tent holding her phone telling you, we have not eaten today, we have walked for water, we lost our home, we don't know where we go next. This collapses the distance between us and them. It forces the viewer to confront the humanity of people who have been abstracted for decades. The question of genocide and the burden of interpretation. So we've already talked about the legal criteria. We've talked about evidence and denials, and we've already talked about how intent can be inferred. So the question of genocide matters because when a population cannot flee, cannot access food or water, cannot give birth freely, cannot bury their dead, cannot rebuild, cannot protect their children, cannot imagine a future, the question becomes not just legal but existential. What does it mean for a people to endure conditions that systematically erode their ability to survive as a group? And despite everything, people still cook for each other. Children play, families still share what little they have, creators still document, communities still form, people still love, mourn, hope, and endure. This is part of the story that cannot be captured in statistics or legal definitions. It is the part that helps us understand that Palestinians are not symbols, not abstractions, not geopolitical talking points. They are human beings navigating conditions no human being should ever have to endure. When you strip away the politics, the borders, the factions, and the headlines, what remains is a population trying to survive conditions that would break any society. And through their phones, their words, and their footage, they are asking the world not to just watch, but to understand. When we opened the series in part 1, we didn't begin with war or borders or modern politics. We began with a question: what is Zionism? We traced its origins in 19th century Europe, the fears, the aspirations that shaped it, and the competing visions within the movement itself. We grounded the episode in the ideological soil from which the modern conflict grew. In part 2, we moved into Mandate Palestine, where British policies, demographic shifts, and competing national movements collided. We saw how institutions were built, how tensions escalated, and how the 1948 war and the refugee crisis reshaped the entire region. This was the moment when the map and millions of lives changed permanently. Part 3 carried us into 1960 through 1967, focusing on Gaza under Egyptian administration, the rise of Palestinian nationalism, and the pressures that led to the Six-Day War. We saw how Gaza's political identity began to take shape long before Hamas existed, and how occupation became the defining structure of daily life. In Part 4, we entered the 1970s, a decade of shifting alliances, the PLO's rise, regional wars, and the early architecture of settlement expansion. We watched Palestinian politics move onto the global stage while daily life on the ground grew more constrained. Part 5 brought us through the 1980s and 1990s, the First Intifada, the Oslo Accords, the hope of statehood, and the fragmentation that followed. We saw how the promise of peace was undermined by settlement growth, political division, and the failure to resolve core issues. In Part 6, we covered 2000 through 2005, the Second Intifada, the construction of the separation barrier, the Gaza disengagement, and the political split between Hamas and Fatah. This was the decade when the geography of Palestinian life hardened into the shapes we recognize today. Gaza sealed, the West Bank fragmented, and the political landscape fractured. And now in Part 7, we've walked through the years from 2000 to present. Blockade, stagnation, repeated wars, humanitarian collapse, the rise of social media documentation, the 2023 to 2025 catastrophe, and the lived reality of displacement, hunger, and survival. We've looked at mortality, agency, anthropology, legal frameworks, and the human cost of a crisis that has spanned generations. Across all 7 parts, a single thread runs through the story. Structures shape lives, policies change possibilities, and ordinary people carry the weight of decisions they did not make. This series has not been about simplifying a complex history. It has been about finding the tools to understand how we arrived at a moment where civilians are filming their own displacement, where children are growing up in tents, and where the future of an entire people hangs in the balance. And as we close part 7, we return to the same grounding principle that opened part 1. You cannot understand the present without understanding the path that led us here. And you cannot understand that path without seeing the people who have walked it, generation after generation, through hope, loss, endurance, and the insistence on being seen. And that is where we're going to end this episode. Let me put this big guy down. I thank you for watching. And if you made it through all 7 parts, an extra big thank you to you. This concludes this series. The next talk I am planning will be on the grandmother hypothesis. So we'll shift gears quite a bit. If you found this informational, please give me a like, a share, respectful comments. I'm not trying to breed hate in my comment section. And if you're not already subscribed, please hit that subscription button. If you are unfamiliar with my channel, if this was your first view through, please head to the YouTube library, take a look around. There's a wide variety of things there. I have many more talks planned. This week just was a little wacky for me because I had some stuff I had to deal with my kids' school, which is still ongoing, so that may impact how next weekend looks, but this will be my only release for this weekend. So if you're used to getting 2 or 3, sorry, this week, this is the only one I was able to squeeze in. And as always, thank you for being here. I appreciate your presence, and I'll see you next time.